Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Unpacking Islamophobia. My name is Mobashir Tazamal, and I'm the Associate Director of The.Bridge.Initiative. Today, we'll be in conversation with Dr. Peter Hopkins on his new book, Everyday Islamophobia. It was published this past September and focuses on how Islamophobia pervades the daily lives of Muslims and those perceived to be Muslim, drawing upon work by the author and leading researchers. Um, it's a deeply important book given the drastic rise of anti-Muslim hate crimes in the UK. Recent Home Office figures show that hate crimes against Muslims in England and Wales have risen by nearly 20%. Muslims account for 45% of all victims of religious hate crimes. The book is comprehensive. It not only unpacks the issue of anti-Muslim racism, but also offers practical guidance on how to address it. Dr. Hopkins outlines 5 interconnected aims of the book, including clarifying the meaning of Islamophobia and how it operates, examining how it intersects with other forms of discrimination and marginalization, and exploring effective ways to challenge and counter it. From teacher to parents to policymakers, this book is an essential read for anyone wanting to learn more about Islamophobia, and the role each of us can play in tackling it. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Hopkins. We'll jump right in. I'm sure you know, recently the working group set up by the Labour government delivered its recommendations regarding an official definition of Islamophobia. This is just the latest in what appears to be a very heated and drawn out debate over the concept of Islamophobia. As you know, there have been repeated calls by rights groups, academics, and community leaders urging the UK government to establish an official definition of Islamophobia. In 2019, the APPG on British Muslims published a landmark report and proposed a definition of the term, and that was adopted by many organizations, local authorities, and leading political parties. However, there was pushback and criticism, and the ruling Conservative Party at the time failed to adopt it. Can you explain how debates about defining Islamophobia might themselves reflect broader Islamophobic attitudes or structures? And do you think the reluctance and failure to define Islamophobia is rooted in actual concern?
Thanks a lot for that. Yeah, I don't actually think the concerns around this are rooted in real issues. I think it's all a strategy of Islamophobia. It's a sort of strategy of masking and avoidance. So in the book, I talk about Islamophobia being, it can be a form of hate crime, it can be discriminatory, stigmatizing. But Islamophobia can also operate through sort of absences and silences. And I think this is one way in which we're seeing this. It's almost like if there's not a definition, it can kind of be questioned and it's not really seen to be a real thing. And therefore, in different departments or different organisations that might have definitions of different forms of discrimination, they don't have one in Islamophobia because it's there's this whole debate around it. So I think it's a whole strategy of avoidance. And I don't mind debating academic terminology. I mean, academics love that, don't they? Like debating terminology and working out the best term. But mostly they agree or they agree to disagree, but they come up with a definition and they move on and they use that particular term. Whereas what we're seeing here is just this constant like cycle of definitions and terminology. And they just need to pick one, and there's quite a selection of them to pick from. There's the Runnymede Trust one, there's an updated Runnymede Trust, there's the APPG version, like you said. There's European definitions as well. I mean, I went to one meeting in Brussels, and I think somebody gave out a sheet of paper. And there was 9 different definitions of Islamophobia on it, and it's like just pick one and agree to that, rather than playing this kind of game of defining it and not defining it and offering a definition and then declining to accept that definition and such like. I think it's a really good example of how absences and silences are part of processes that are in themselves Islamophobic.
Yeah, I think it's also from my following of it, it's also a good way to divert attention away from the problem.
Totally.
So the conversation kind of becomes very nitpicky and very just picking words and whatnot when the problem continues to rise. I mean, we talked about the hate crime figures, and what is going on in the UK with the growth of the far right and whatnot. And this seems to be taking attention away from the actual issue and the impacts on the communities.
Totally.
And
Yeah.
instead just kind of seems to be not even a back and forth. It just seems to be driven by a certain segment with a certain agenda. And the constant argument, we hear is the issue of free speech. I'd like to get your thoughts on that, in terms of how do you think, are there actual concerns when it comes to free speech? Because I don't hear that argument when it comes to definitions of other forms of bigotry.
Yeah, no, I don't think there's an issue with it. I mean, I'm not a legal expert, but some of the stuff I've read says that there's not issues with it. And
Hmm.
and if there is an issue with, say, Islamophobia, that there's less of an issue with anti-Muslim racism, we'll call it anti-Muslim racism and come up with a definition of that and say that you're not using Islamophobia. At least we know that there's a thing there, but they're not even doing that.
Hmm.
So like you say, I think the big issue for me is I think that rather than looking at the issue and working out how to address it and coming up with strategies or policies to address Islamophobia or whatever you want to call it. Instead, it becomes a debate about the definition. And so, if anything's raised about hate crime statistics, people start going, "Oh, but do we know what Islamophobia is? What's the definition? What does it mean? Oh, they're still consulting on that. Oh, right." And then they kind of ignore the fact that the numbers have increased or that there's been so many incidents and they end up focusing just on the definition. And
Yeah.
I've been in loads of meetings. It happens. It's interesting how I think sometimes these sort of policy level debates can then be played out in everyday life. And I've been in forums, including with Muslims, where that becomes the debate. It's like, oh, but we don't know what the definition. Oh, I don't like Islamophobia. I prefer it that, or anti-Muslim hatred, or da da da. And you have a whole debate around the term. And I'm just thinking, and I know a lot of people are getting really, really intolerant of it and really tired of it because it
Hmm.
silences and downplays the whole issue. And it
Hmm.
becomes this whole debate around the term, and they kind of want to pull their hair out because it's so frustrating that we're not moving on, sort of thing.
Yeah, I think that also for the actual word Islamophobia, that was something that we've heard in our work when Bridge started, is that there have been, and rightful, I think, discussions around, is this the best terminology to use? And from our perspective, it's been that it has weight, it has currency, it's been widely used. And like you said, there are multiple definitions. I mean, there's so many academics who've written books, and you've written a book on it. There are academics who have defined it, who explain it. So today, in this day and age, to continue going back to that conversation that 20, 15 years ago we've been having, like you said in your book, is a tactic to undermine the problem and the severity of it. And also it kind of allows especially political figures to continue doing and saying what they do, because a lot of their policies and rhetoric are Islamophobic. And so if there if there was a definition that is someone we all agree on and rightfully call out, they would fall under that category.
Totally. Yeah, and I think also in the process, like, because with the APPG definition, I mean, they consulted academics
Hmm.
and community leaders and a whole host of people on that. And to then not take that up for whatever reason is kind of it devalues the kind of integrity of your your intellectuals and other people that were involved in that. It's
Hmm.
almost like you know and again, it was widely consulted. It wasn't like just a small group of kind of people that were close to government or whatever. It was, normal people like me that were involved in that. So there's it does a lot of other damage as well, actually, and there's a lack of trust and things there. So I mean, I think that's a sideline compared to the main issue around Islamophobia. But I think to me that really shows it kind of almost shows that they're showing their full cards. They're just playing a game here. It's like a game of poker or something like that, and we'll see if we can win and keep the most cards or whatever. And it's that type of thing that feels to me like what's going on, rather than there actually being a genuine interest. And like you said, the group in the UK that now consulted around this definition have sent the definition to government, and it's like, what are we waiting for? Like I know they need to consult and whatever, but it's not like a university where there's like 10 committees that needs to go through. The government can look at it and agree to adopt it. And
Hmm.
they can make an announcement now or tomorrow morning saying they've adopted it and all the departments are going to put this on their website. Job done, let's go in and address it. But they're not doing that. We're still waiting. So
Yeah.
waiting is part of the process here. It's like a bit like what they do in the asylum system. It's like make everyone wait.
Hmm.
you know, that'll kind of draw people down and tire them out. It feels like there's a bit of that going on as well.
And you can keep pushing the timeline.
Yeah,
Uh, and if given the severity of the situation with the rise in hate speech online with the far right, with we've had riots the last couple of years. We had the Unite the Kingdom rally. Um, and given obviously the figures that we've talked about, you would think that there is a need and an urgency to agree to recognizing this issue and then taking the steps to tackle it. But there is a reluctance to even have that agreement in place, and kind of pushing that timeline forward. And this brings me to my next question, where, in the book you argue that everyday Islamophobia is not just a form of interpersonal intolerance. And by that, that's like forms of harassment on the street by one individual to another individual. You argue that's deeply structural and political. Can you expand on this for our audience, and in particular, the role of discursive elites in entrenching Islamophobic attitudes?
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the main things I wanted to try and get across in the book is when I hear people talk about everyday Islamophobia, it's almost like because it's everyday, it's not as important. It's sort of trivial, it's mundane. It happens to happen at the bus stop or on the train or in the supermarket or in the grocery store or wherever it happened. It's just this kind of like unfortunate engagement that you have. Somebody kind of gives you a funny look or makes a comment on the bus or whatever it is. Um, and in one case, that in some senses that is what it is. It's an unfortunate encounter, but for me, those encounters are sort of empowered by this global system of Islamophobia through the media, politicians, government departments, the state, and so it's far more structural and institutional than that. Just that sort of everyday encounter is. Quite often I hear people say, "Oh, it was just a bit of an unfortunate encounter with somebody who wasn't very educated." So the assumption is there's this sort of uneducated other who's made an unfortunate remark. Sometimes I think that maybe they are quite educated, that they've been reading all this stuff that's been produced by what I call the Islamophobia industrial complex. So I think there's a whole set of structures and processes in place that encourage people to practice everyday Islamophobia. Like counter-terrorism policies that encourage the sort of surveillance and monitoring of people that might be Muslim or look Muslim, and they should be monitored and subject to border controls. And you should be suspicious of them if they're carrying a big bag, and and if they're a guy, they've got a beard, and the woman, they've got a headscarf. We should keep an eye on them. That type of thing. Um, so I think that's why I don't find it satisfactory when people just talk about everyday Islamophobia as if it's sort of not as important as the other types of Islamophobia. So I think a more sort of integrative approach work better in terms of how we understand that. Um, and in the book, one of the things I talk about in the industrial complex is these discursive elites. So by that, I'm meaning the sort of public intellectuals. Some academics are really bad at promoting Islamophobia, and they really give it a platform. So just included, so not just academics, but there's also like the media, newsreaders, people that are, in elite positions, and they're responsible for setting the tone and the language and the topics that are discussed. So journalists, media, public intellectuals, or other figures, think tanks and people like that might be on the news a lot. And they play a really key role in sort of giving these issues a platform. And quite obviously, the media can be really right wing and very explicitly nasty, but a lot of the discursive elites are quite often like men in suits that look really smart and clever, and they're really well dressed, and they give the impression they know what they're talking about, and they can be very well spoken, with a kind of cut glass accent sort of thing, and especially in the UK, and so they've got a sort of authority to them because of how they present, but in what they're doing, they're promoting Islamophobia, and they're platforming debates around immigration, and but it's all in the name of free speech and talking about important issues and all the rest of it. So they dress it up in that way, but actually they're kind of letting Islamophobia in through the side door. And I think there's a lot of people in that group. And going back to the definition, I think that some academics who like to constantly debate the definition, and this tends to be people not in Islamophobia studies, it tends to be, I've had this at conferences or events where a well-meaning academic will, oh, can I just ask you about the definition? And I kind of roll my eyes and oh, here we go again. And they're doing it in the name of like scholarly rigor and being a good academic, asking about the definition. But really what they're doing is they're letting Islamophobia in through the side door. And that's what the discursive elites, in my view, do. in sort of helping this industrial complex and help its power and enable the spread of Islamophobia.
That is so much of I think what I try to present in my work as well, in the sense that I don't think that Islamophobia, the way it is presented today in terms of interpersonal interactions, is an organic sort of thing. In the sense that if you look at a lot of hate crimes or a lot of instances of anti-Muslim rhetoric being on the streets, or Muslims, what they experience every day, it's not something that the perpetrator just naturally feels. It's something that they have been listening to, that is surrounded. We are surrounded by, as a Muslim myself, I am surrounded by it. You know, you look on your social media, you look at what the politicians are saying, you look at what tabloid media is saying, and all of it are presenting this view of Muslims as a threat, Muslims as the other, Muslims as not belonging, specifically in Britain, Muslims as you have the grooming gangs theory, you have all of these stereotypes and tropes, and the everyday person is being fed these things. And then you have instances where those stereotypes and tropes come out in interactions on in everyday life. But there's a constant inability or unwillingness to connect that to the discursive elites that you talk about in the book. You've mentioned the Islamophobia industrial complex, and that actually goes into my next question of looking at Islamophobia as a social and political enterprise. Can you go into what the Islamophobia industrial complex it is, and how does it operate globally? Who would you say are the key players or the sectors involved in sustaining this, and how do they benefit from it?
Yeah, that's great. I bring in this idea of the Islamophobia industrial complex. So an industrial complex is where a set of financial beneficiaries and like businesses and trade develops around a sort of social or political issue, and therefore people start to sort of financially benefit from it. So I think where we see this most obviously, and a really good example of it, and Junaid Rana's written about this, is the terror industrial complex. So we see this in the sort of counter-terrorism model, where there's a whole load of people that are paid a whole load of money to basically enact counter-terrorism policies. So there's people that are paid loads of money to train people on these counter-terrorism policies, to produce training manuals, online updates, and all the rest of it. There's a whole industry there of people that do that. And then there's all the sort of border control people that are trained in that. And certainly in a lot of places, there's institutions where somebody has a counter-terrorism role. So certainly in the UK, hospitals, universities, colleges all have a prevent officer who's paid to basically manage the institutions conforming to that policy. So there's a whole range of like foot soldiers, if you like, that are part of this industrial complex. And you can be paid quite good money to get involved in that and get trained on it, or become a trainer. And so essentially this is a sort of a moral and political issue around counter-terrorism and the global war on terror. And rather than that just being a sort of political idea, they've made it into a network and a set of industries and trades. And these things are shared globally. So a lot of the counter-terrorism policies are shared between countries. Like China copied the kind of techniques used in the West around this. Even though there was no evidence that they worked very well, if anything, there was the opposite of that. So, so that's why I called it an industrial complex. In terms of the Islamophobia industrial complex, I would say the terror industrial complex is part of it, but it's much bigger. So I would say the main members of this industrial complex are the state and the counter-terrorism apparatus of that, but around and about that, and quite often working quite closely with the state, are like think tanks. There might be the media, people in the media, different journalists and other media actors, public intellectuals and figures like we've talked about, politicians and politics in general, but also far-right activists and right-wing religious groups. So all of them can basically benefit financially. They can gain funding and resources. They can get airtime, and they can gather large followers, which means that they can then accrue income and money through basically the promotion of Islamophobia. And quite often they work quite closely together. So there's some think tanks that work really closely with government. So there's like Islamophobic think tank chief executives working really closely with government and meeting with like presidents and prime ministers and like informing policy and and things like that. So there's clear evidence that that's going on. And these all, so sometimes they work close together, sometimes they're a bit separate, but they kind of inform each other. So we see that saying like far right activists, so like Tommy Robinson and him getting media coverage and other public intellectuals talking about and profiling him. And so you see these sorts of, some people would say, oh, but Tommy Robinson's not elected, he's not part of the state, but he's got other networks within this industrial complex that he can use, and he gets funded to do it and gets paid money to promote it. So you can see this really concerning network, and it is quite global. So some of these key figures get invited to other places. So like there's Geert Wilders goes to Australia and does talks, and I'm sure he's paid quite handsomely to do it, and all these expenses will be paid. And he goes over there to basically spread Islamophobic messaging. But also, some people don't need to even do that because the media can do it for them. So basically, there's this sort of network of these different groups of people that are promoting Islamophobia and making a lot of money in the process. So there's a great chapter in the What is Islamophobia book, and they chart how much money people were getting paid to promote, and there was six-figure salaries for like a day or a day and a half's work on writing like 8 to 10 really Islamophobic blog posts, and you're making like $200,000 a year. I mean, it's mind blowing. So this isn't just somebody making like 10 quid off YouTube or something like that. This is like big money, and it's all sort of mutually reinforcing. So that's why I've called it an industrial complex, because of the nature of the trade and the business and the amount of money and finance that's basically being generated in the process.
I really liked that terminology because I've often used the Islamophobia network, but I think the industrial complex really outlines the cross-pollination and the interconnectedness and the way individuals and think tanks and organizations and politicians and media networks work within this industry. It just kind of better explains. And I think financially, the finances play a big role. I do think a lot of individuals specifically have built platforms for themselves off being anti-Muslim activists, whatever you want to call it, anti-Muslim, even social media influencer at this point. I would say, you mentioned Tommy Robinson, and I think he's a perfect example of starting off as an anti-Muslim voice, building his persona online, working with think tanks. I'm sure you remember there was that very, um, I don't even know the word to describe it, that video of him sitting with Majid Nawaz and another person from Quilliam where he had de-radicalized or whatever you want to call it, and there was inner workings between them. And we all know Quilliam was also funded by the government, and Quilliam really pushed forth counter-terror policies that discriminated against Muslims. So you see the workings of all of these individuals, and the part where you said it is international. Most recently, one of Israel's ministers invited Tommy Robinson to Israel to speak. And so you can see how it is not just relegated to one country, it is a global complex, industrial complex. You talked about China. China literally calls their programming, their campaign targeting Uyghurs in Xinjiang as the People's War on Terror. That's what it is. And War on Terror, obviously, we all know, begun by the Bush administration post 9/11, and a lot of the War on Terror is rooted in very, very Islamophobic discourse and Islamophobic aims. So yeah, I think that terminology really captures the complexity within this, but also really touches on the financial aspect, which there have been multiple studies in the US. Fear Inc. was a big study back in, I think, 2011, I think was the last time they did it. But Jasmine Zine in Canada has also done a study, and she has estimated billions that can be made. Made kind of, there's grants, there's funding, there's dark money involved because there's donors that you don't know who they are. So it just gets very complex for the lack of a better word. But I think that terminology that you propose in the book really captures perfectly what this world is really.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think in the book I mentioned that Tommy Robinson was getting, was it $5,000 a month to
Mhm.
write for, Islamophobic posts for, I can't remember the name of the website.
Was it the Rebel? The Rebel Media?
Your
Yeah,
rebel media,
yeah,
that's it.
yeah.
Yeah, some people see him as the sort of the voice of the working class, and I'm thinking, well, he's not working
He's
class if he's getting $5,000 a month to do
yeah,
quite a few pieces. So I think
yeah.
that's a really another nice example, just a kind of on the ground example of somebody who might be seen as white working class and one of us or whatever people would say, but actually he's getting all this money for what he's doing.
Yeah, yeah. We've been also mentioning, China's treatment of the Uyghurs, and that's one of the examples you discuss in the book, along with Trump's Muslim ban, France's denial of the existence of Islamophobia. What do these cases tell us about how Islamophobia operates at the state level?
Yeah, I think we've talked about counter-terrorism policies, and I think that's one example of how deeply embedded Islamophobia is at the state level. But also, I think we see Islamophobia being sort of promoted through, political leadership and through policies, and the close relationship that exists between, you know, the state and those that are in charge and some of these think tanks and, influencers or whatever you want to call them. So I think that, there's a deeply personal relationship between the state and Islamophobia. It's not something that's out there and separate from the state. I think it's deeply enmeshed within it, and it's a part of how it thinks and how it operates. We see this routinely in how politicians respond to anything to do with, I've just been looking at some of the stuff about, Trump in the reaction to the guy that's probably going to be elected in New York. And it's just, it's immediately read through a sort of veneer of Islamophobia. And we see that in other places as well. So I think it's deeply embedded within that, but the state also reinforces Islamophobia through its policies and through its practices. And that then trickles down into everyday life. So again, going back to the whole everyday thing, I think the national and the sort of everyday are sort of part and parcel of the same thing, and they're kind of embedded in each other together. So it's not that it's separate from the everyday; they kind of inform each other, and informs what's in the newspapers and what's on the news and what's on social media, and people read that and see it and worry about what might happen to them, or encourages them to be Islamophobic because they see it being practiced by the state. And I think also you see these sort of policy imperatives being enacted by people on the ground. So like in the riots last summer in the UK, not that far from me in Middlesbrough, like sort of hour away, people were being stopped in the street and like racially profiled, and if they were white, they were allowed to drive on, and these like random people were like stopping them and like checking what their race was. I'm assuming it was, and I just thought, well, they're just copying the state. It's like they're doing border control. It's like coming into London Heathrow and you go through border security and they kind of look you up and down and check your passport. And you're far more likely to be questioned or pulled aside if you're not white, and if you're called Mohammed or whatever, you'll be far more likely to be questioned. And it was almost they were just copying the state. So this is just ordinary people in Middlesbrough. So I think that's the power that the state can have in projecting and reinforcing this, and then people copy it because they think that's what they should be doing. So I think the state's got a lot to answer for, basically. I think it's the key pillar. I mean, in the kind of the five pillars of Islamophobia, it's seen as the key pillar. I would agree with that.
Yeah, I think that is something I very much so am on the same page of the role of the state. I mean, if you look at Islamophobia in the past, since 9/11 is really when it was heightened and really, really came into the form that it is today, although today I think it's at a much more heightened level. But it was really the state's response and reaction and knee-jerk reaction in terms of the US. Um, to the attacks that laid the foundation for how Islamophobia has been built, in terms of um, holding Muslims collectively responsible, the whole counter-terror apparatus that came about. I mean, we had an entire in the US, we had DHS, Department of Homeland Security, didn't exist before. That was an entire department of the government that was created post 9/11. And these sorts of policies that have come about have all been rooted in the state's perception and characterization of Muslims and Islam. So, Muslims practicing their belief in cases of Europe, Muslim women wearing the hijab, outwardly expressing their religious identity is viewed by the state as and antithetical to quote Western values or national identity. And again, there's a policing of that by the state. And
mm,
so that kind of trickles down to the everyday individual where Muslim women are targeted on the street by individuals, especially if they're wearing a hijab or niqab. I'm sure you remember, I mean, the big incident that I always think about is when Boris Johnson, who was prime minister at the time, used the slur against Muslim women who wear the niqabs, likening them to a letterbox.
mm,
And I think Tell Mama recorded that there was like a 300%
yeah,
increase in hate crimes against Muslim women literally the week after he said those remarks. And that kind of tells you the role of the state in the narratives that
mm,
um, are kind of ingested by the public, kind of, what they take in and what they learn and what they hear from those in power. You also touched on Mamdani, and I think it's we're recording this on what is election day in the US, and it's a quite a historic day. And Mamdani's campaign, his entire campaign has um brought back in full force this response from opponents and individuals that don't like him, a very, very anti-Muslim backlash. We've seen like politicians from the right and the left all, either call him disloyal, say, he's a quote terrorist sympathizer. But I think what's really interesting is that, at least from the polls and from my observations of the US public and especially New Yorkers, that strategy hasn't fully worked. In the sense that Mamdani has been pushing forth a message of, he has policies and it's not just about identity, but he did respond to the Islamophobic backlash and put out I don't know if you've seen it on social media, he put out a really brilliant video where he masterfully addresses it,
mm,
calls it out, talks about how it's a strategy being used by these politicians, and then focuses on the everyday Muslim who's been impacted by these policies. And he has said, Muslim New Yorkers, they're not all candidates like me who have the ability to, who have a team around me that can, um, I'm not being targeted in the way that Muslim New Yorkers every day can be harassed and have to face these anti-Muslim aggressions. And I think the Mamdani campaign captures the role of the state, the everyday Islamophobia, but also centers Muslims because Mamdani himself is
mm,
Muslim.
yeah.
So yeah,
Oh,
that mentioning of Mamdani I felt like was a good way to bring that all together as well.
yeah, no, that's very interesting to look up that video. That sounds great because, I mean, in a sense, it's great, but then you shouldn't need to do that as well. But this is the kind of situation that a lot of Muslim leaders are put in, where they need to have a really smart, carefully kind of, worded response to these sorts of things. Because of the operation of the industrial complex, they're kind of put in this position where they have to have this sort of really smart PR campaign, and some of that can cost a lot of money as well because of what you're up against.
Yeah, money, time, energy, and also he did previously mention the mental and emotional toll of these attacks, of people messaging him and his campaign saying really horrendous things of just threats, but also really horrendous things to him and his family. And you capture that in your book of the mental and emotional toll of everyday Islamophobia. You discuss the concept of weathering and how chronic exposure to Islamophobia harms mental and physical health. Can you explain this process and its significance?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I hadn't read up much about this before when I started writing the book, but it was something that I knew from my research with Muslims and also just reading the literature that we were almost at the point now where experiences of Islamophobia are sort of so regular and so familiar that people can almost predict when they're going to happen. So like I'm sure I was talking to somebody the other day who mentioned the election in New York and said, oh, they're ready for a wave of Islamophobia. And it's almost like they know what's going to happen because this guy's going to get elected, and then there'll be some people that won't like it. So it's almost like people can kind of predict when it's going to happen because they're so kind of used to it. And so I felt it was important for me to try and mention in the book what, the sort of socio-psychological and health risks associated with this. And I found this really interesting book about weathering, and it talks about this as a sort of chronic physical and environmental stressors that are placed on bodies that are sort of marginalised and stigmatised. And so, and because of the kind of the regularity and the constant process of this experience of Islamophobia, or indeed other forms of marginalisation, those it kind of has this sort of physiological effect on the body, and it kind of wears the body down a bit like being weathered, like a stone, the weathering of a stone, and it gradually kind of erodes down. And the argument in this book by Arlene Geronimus is that it goes right down to the cellular level, and it kind of develops, as you grow up and as you grow older, and it kind of affects you. So I thought that was quite a powerful way. I mean, there's other ways that people talk about this in terms of like, racial battle fatigue and things like that. But there's something about the weathering argument that just really struck a chord with me in terms of what people were telling me about what happens when they experience Islamophobia and its sort of physical, mental, and emotional impacts of it. And you know, and and I'm not saying that everyone who experiences Islamophobia is at home with like severe mental health issues, but there's more just the point that it gradually takes its toll, perhaps in a way that we're not really aware of. It's quite a subtle thing, but it's not just that people can kind of brush it off and move on. And I think I mentioned Manzoor Khan's book, and she talks about how Islamophobia lives under the skin of those it marks, and it kind of alters your physiology through trauma. And it kind of lives in your nervous system, and it can promote a sort of sense of being hyper vigilant. And I feel that's what's happening when people are like ready
Mhm.
for. I mean, this is the kind of thing that the literature on domestic violence talks about this as well. It's almost like you're predicting that there's going to be an abusive happening in the next 12 hours, or it's going to, your partner's going to come home in the evening and they're going to be annoyed because for whatever reason, and there might be domestic violence. It's a bit like that. It's a similar type of issue, that in terms of how it works. And I know so many people that talk about this, even my old school in Glasgow, which is very ethnically diverse. And one of the reasons I've probably researched this topic, the deputy head teacher, who was my religious studies teacher when I was at school, she's literally just retired. She says this to me. If there's any issue in the public domain or in politics, a bit like Boris Johnson's, letterbox thing, something like that. She's like, it's going to kick off tomorrow. There's going to be issues in school. And so she can, it's sort of like the kind of stress prediction model or something like that. It's a bit
Mhm.
like that. And I think that's what's happening here when it comes to people's experiences of Islamophobia and almost their kind of their radar and when it's going to happen.
Yeah, I think that really touches on the part where you talked about preparing and almost predicting. And I think over again the last 20 plus years of the cycles that we've had, as a Muslim myself, there are moments where I have literally said, okay, prepare yourself tomorrow. This is going to be in the news. This is how they're going to be framing it. It's going to be a week of really, really horrendous things being said about Muslims, and no one's going to say anything in response. Um, just also for visibly Muslim women, especially those who wear hijabs and niqabs, of being more vigilant on outside and having it's very much so. There's been a number of studies talking about Muslim mental health, and especially actually with Muslim students and children, and the level of anxiety and the level of depression and fear is really quite high because again, with anxiety, it's preparing yourself for all these different scenarios that can happen. And one doesn't need to be an expert, but just knowing how the media cycles things and the narratives that are pushed out. Let's say, I mean, the most recent thing that happened in Cambridge with the stabbing attack.
Mhm.
It's almost as if you're waiting. Okay, how is the media going to frame this? What
Mhm.
words are they going to use? If it's a terrorist attack, you know who the perpetrator is. If it's not, and then it's going to be framed as a lone wolf or someone with mental health issues, then you know who the perpetrator is. And then those two pathways kind of create those two identities will lead to different pathways in terms of how the information is presented.
Mm,
And yeah, I think that is a part of your book that isn't, I feel like it's not addressed enough.
mm,
And I think that's one of the really important parts that you touch on, that I hope that there's more research done into it.
mm,
Because I do think there are long-term consequences and impacts of experiencing or living this reality that we are in today. That we just fully can't capture, because like it's like you've said, it's can be at a cellular level and it's happening little by little, and we don't know how it's going to manifest itself.
Yeah, totally. And I think there's something really pernicious about the regularity of it. So, if you have one experience of Islamophobia that's quite nasty and that's all you have, over time that'll kind of diminish in its significance. But if you're like repeatedly having incidents, and it's constantly reappearing in your life, that kind of re-emergence again and again, that's the thing that does the damage, because it ends up you're kind of on alert most of the time because of
Mhm.
that kind of because it's constantly appearing and reappearing. But also, it's interesting in terms of just what you've said about mental health, and because you also talked about lone wolves, and isn't it interesting how you get somebody like Anders Breivik in Norway, or you get Brenton Tarrant in New Zealand, and they're sort of seen as either lone wolves or they've got mental health issues or they're kind of a bit eccentric, and that kind of allows them that to be explained away.
Mhm.
Whereas there's an issue here about mental health for Muslims who are or others who experience Islamophobia, but there's not really that much research on it. There's some, but it's not talked about nearly as much. It's
Mhm.
a bit of a it feels to me there's a bit of a dichotomy there in terms of what people are focusing on and how things have been framed.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that outlook. Um, I've come to my last question. What do you hope readers, both Muslims and non-Muslims alike, take away from your book?
Oh, I would hope people take away the idea that everyday Islamophobia isn't only about the sort of everyday encounters on public transport or at the supermarket or the grocery store or whatever, but it's also shaped by much broader sort of global, national, institutional issues that sort of embolden it and empower it to happen. So it's not just an unfortunate encounter with somebody down the street. It's got these other factors that are a part of it. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is that as part of that, I hope that people might appreciate a bit more that the person being Islamophobic might be ignorant and uneducated, but they might not be, because
Mhm.
they might be reading up on stuff that's being produced by the Islamophobia industrial complex. So there's this whole network of people that are benefiting financially and morally through promoting this. They're taking the moral high ground and they're making lots of money in the process, and then people are reading this and engaging with it. Um, and then I hope that people might take something from some of the suggestions in the literature about how we can address it. There's lots of interesting work that people have done, like in terms of like educational initiatives or on the ground work,
Mhm.
but at the same time, some of that work will really have limited impacts unless we can almost take down the industrial complex, remove the counter-terrorism legislation, and abolish the structures and systems in place that reinforce it. But there is some really inspiring work, like the grief activism work in response to the incident in London and Ontario. I thought there was some great stuff around that, and there's really amazing toolkits on the kinds of things that people could do on a daily basis if they want to challenge Islamophobia. So I suppose that's probably the thing I would most want people to take away. If somebody's concerned about Islamophobia and is wanting to challenge it, perhaps there might be things in that chapter that you could do in your daily life. If you're a teacher or a social worker or whoever you are, you might be reading that thinking, well, what can I do? And there might be things in that chapter that you could take forward that you know might help you feel like you're addressing Islamophobia. Um, so I hope that Muslims who read the book feel supported and encouraged that this issue's been mapped out, and I hope they might see some of themselves in the book in terms of the experiences of Muslims that are talked about based on empirical research. And for non-Muslims, I hope they read the book and realise what an important challenge we have around this and might act more actively as allies in order to challenge Islamophobia.
Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. I'm going to tell our audience to please check out this book, Everyday Islamophobia. It is really an essential read for understanding Islamophobia and also providing ways to how we can in our everyday lives tackle it and address it and acknowledge it. Um, yeah, thank you so much, Peter. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. For our listeners, please do tune into our next episode. And do check out more of our work on our website, bridge.georgetown.edu. Thank you so much.